Come on in. Well, it's 7 o'clock. Glad you're here tonight. Good to have our visitors with us as always for our Wednesday evening Bible study. We'll begin with a word of prayer tonight. And Glenn Martin, would you lead us in prayer? Tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the omnipotence of God, meaning all-powerful, infinite power. Nothing greater than God when it comes to power, when it comes to knowledge, when it comes to being everywhere. That's God. He's all places at all time, all-powerful. Anyone that can create the universe as he did with just a word, that certainly is all-powerful. And that's what he is. But tonight we're going to look at a question that's tied into that. Probably a question you have asked yourself before. It's a question you may have even lost sleep over. A question that goes, I think, all the way back to Adam and Eve. I think they probably had this question as well. And I've yet to hear anybody really answer it. But yet, and listen to some individuals talk about it, I think we got an answer. And here's that question. Can God make a rock so big that he cannot move it? You ever heard that question before? Never heard that question? Anybody else? Am I the only one in the universe? I got a couple of hands going up. So what about it? Can God make a rock so big that he cannot move it? He's all-powerful. The Bible, the Scriptures bring that out on different occasions. So how do we go about answering that question? If he can make it, then what's that say? If he can make one so big that he can't move, then he's not all-powerful. If he can't make one so big that he can't move, then he's not all-powerful. So what about the question? How does that question relate? And the problem is, it's a trick question. And we'll get into that in a moment, how it's a trick question. Because it cannot be answered with a simple yes or no. It takes more thought going into it. The trick question is almost like asking the husband a yes or no question. Do you still beat your wife? You know, if he says yes, he's had it. If he says no, it means once he did. You can't answer, and you can't answer this one with a yes or no question. So where do you start when it comes to this question? Well, some people want to think when it comes to what God can do, there's nothing beyond his ability. Well, if he's all powerful, then how can there be anything beyond his ability? And they'll use Matthew 19:26, where it says, "But Jesus looked at them and said to them, with men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible." When Jesus says, with God all things are possible, does he mean all things are possible? Is that what he's meaning here? Everything is possible with God? Or is there something else going on here? And what we got to be careful we don't do, how many will use this verse to say everything's possible with God. What we got to do here, make sure we keep the verse in context and try to understand what is Christ speaking about, what would bring him to say this, that with men it is impossible, but with God all things are possible. But if you back up to chapter 19, you'll find where a young man, rich young ruler as he is called, he comes to Christ and he wants to know about salvation, the kingdom of God. And he's a pretty good man. He has a pretty good resume. But when Christ says to him, you got to give up your riches, give to the poor, come and follow me, as we know the story, he walks away sorrowful. He's unwilling to give it up. Now, when he walks away sorrowful with a good resume that he has, the disciples are there, and they ask Christ, hey, well, who can be saved? If this young man can't be saved, who can be saved? And that's the question that they are asking. And that brings Christ to say what he says here in 19:26. With men, this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible. This is speaking about salvation. He's got this narrowed down, not to cover everything, but he's talking specifically about salvation right here. And he's showing that human efforts cannot save a person. I don't care how good you are. I don't care how many commandments you keep. Human efforts cannot save a person. It's only the grace of God that can save a person. And what God can do, he can remove that object that's standing between a person and God. God can remove that. He can do it. How does he do it? Through the Scriptures. We read about the grace of God, how he loves us, how he sent his Son to this earth to die for us. And we learn about all that, and it's hard for us to digest this. How could God love me that much to do that? There's nothing that God cannot remove that would keep us from coming to him. God could have removed that money, the riches of this young ruler. He could have removed that if the young ruler had wanted it to be removed. He came with a good heart, but he left in a very sad condition. But man cannot remove it without God's help. When we study the Scriptures and know what God says, it's possible for anything to be taken away from what stands between us and God. It can do that. And there's some individuals who don't want it to happen. They give excuse after excuse. They don't want to submit to God, do as God will say. They don't want it to be removed. They're sort of happy to where they are. But he's talking about the salvation here. God can remove it if we'll let him. And it comes through the teaching of the gospel when we learn about his Son and what Christ did, when it melts our heart and we ask what those did on day of Pentecost, what must I do to be saved? It can be removed and we can become Christians. So we can't let somebody use Matthew 19:26 to say that everything is possible with God, because there's some things that are not. In Psalms 115 and verse 3, but our God is in heaven and does whatever he pleases. Does God do whatever he pleases? He's omnipotent. He's all-powerful. Why couldn't he? Does he do whatever he pleases to do? What if God wanted to sin? Could God sin? The Bible answers that. What if he wanted to? Well, if we take this to mean that God can do anything he wants to do, then that's going to contradict other verses. That's going to show us differently. For example, Titus 1 and verse 2. In hope of eternal life, which God, who cannot lie, promised before time began. And then Hebrews 6:18, that by two immutable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we might have strong consolation, who have fled for refuge to lay hold of the hope set before us. God cannot do whatever he pleases because it goes against his nature. He's not going to lie. So for one to say he can do anything he wants to do, no, he's not going to lie. It goes against the nature of God. It's impossible for God to lie. He is not going to lie. So for one to say he does whatever he pleases is not correct. I know the scriptures say that, but what he's meaning here is as long as it falls within the realm of his nature, he can do whatever he pleases. But he's not going to go outside his nature and do something that will be sinful. God's not going to do it. He's holy. There's not one little ounce of unholiness in him. He's pure. He's holy. Things that God cannot do. He's not going to lie. 2 Timothy 2:13, if we are faithless, he remains faithful. He cannot deny himself. God's not going to deny himself. He's not going to say, I'm not going to lie, and turn around and lie. He's not going to do that. He's not going to deny himself. Ever how the Bible describes him, that's how he is. There's no lying. It's there in God. If we are faithless, he remains faithful. Is God going to save the atheist? The man dies an atheist. Is God going to save him? No. He can't deny himself because God said in Hebrews 11:6, without faith it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. You got to have faith if you're going to be saved. You got to have it. Not faith alone, faith that operates, that's doing what God says. So that, we'll say the atheist individual, can he be saved? Well, certainly. But if he dies an atheist, God is not going to say, okay, well, he was a good guy. He was a good father. He was a good husband. He was a good whatever. I'm going to save him. Even though he didn't believe in me. God cannot deny himself. He can't go out and save this individual because it would go against the scriptures as to what one must do to be saved. Without faith, we've got to have that faith that brings about an operation of doing as God says. So, God's not going to go out and deny himself. He's not going to go beyond his nature. He's going to do what he says he's going to do. That's what he will do. So, the next slide here, to assume that God can do anything goes against the scriptures. To assume that. He can do anything because he can't. He cannot lie of one thing. He cannot do that. He cannot save without faith of the individual. Can't do that. And here's how we come to answer that question we started with. Can God make a rock so big that he cannot move? Here's here's how we look at that. Next slide there. God can make something from nothing, but he cannot make something and nothing at the same time. He created creation from nothing, but he cannot make something and nothing at the same time. That goes back to that rock. Can he make a rock so big that he cannot move? He cannot create something and then so big he can't move it, then create it so small that he can. He can't do that at the same time. God is limited in that, what he can do. Like the next slide here, God cannot make a square circle. A square is a square, a circle is a circle. God cannot make a stick with one end. There's things God cannot do. He's not going to go beyond who he is, what he has set in motion. So there's two things there that God simply cannot do. On the next slide, God can cause the blind to see, but he cannot cause that person to see and be blind at the same time. You're one or the other. You're one or the other. And next, God can certainly make a virgin pregnant, but he cannot make her pregnant and not pregnant at the same time. So there's that which God cannot do. And that's why that question is a trick question until you bring it to the Scriptures and see what God can do and what he will do. So that slide here, can God make a rock so big that he cannot move it? Well, God cannot create a rock and not create a rock at the same time. Can't do it. And therein lies the problem with that question. The answer is no. He cannot do it. Everybody totally confused? Everybody's got it. So tonight you go to bed, I've been wanting an answer to that question for many, many years. Can God create a rock so big he can't move it? The answer is no. It's a trick question. It doesn't work that way. Any comment on the rock? Someone go back 2 weeks ago. We talked about the giants marrying the angels. I mean, the angels marrying the women on earth, the children of God. And we talked about that a little bit and how the giants. And after the class was over, there were a couple of folks that asked a question, and it's a question I'm sure you thought about. You know, when it came to Cain killed Abel. Later, Seth was born. We saw where Seth had a godly line of people. Cain had an ungodly line. And the question that was asked by a few individuals that night, where did Cain get his wife? Where did he get his wife? Now that one I'm sure you have thought about, right? Where did she come from? Well, it had to be a sister. It had to be a sister that the wife came from. A sister or a sister. Adam and Eve had other children, so he had to marry either a sister or a niece or something like that. It had to be a relative for that to happen. Now Josephus, we often hear Josephus quoted. Now he's not inspired, he's not an apostle. But if you read about his writings, what he wrote about Adam and Eve, he writes about a lot of these Old Testament characters, telling about them. But he said that besides Cain and Seth, and Abel really, Adam and Eve had 33 boys and 23 girls in addition. It wasn't just Cain, Seth, and Abel. They continued to populate the earth even after the death of Abel and after Cain did what he did. There was a continuation there of population. So there you have 56 children that they could have had. And that's just something that Josephus, being a Jewish historian, knowing a lot of these things, going back in history, what the Jews would write, that's what he said. But they certainly had to have another woman in there somewhere. Cain and Abel and Seth had a sister in there somewhere, or else you're not going to have any children if it's all males. I don't care what they say today, a man cannot get pregnant, even though they make the claim of that today. So somewhere in the line there, Cain married his sister, or it could have been a niece, whatever the time frame there came about. If some of Seth's children married each other and a niece came out, he could have married one of those. But he married a family, a relative. That's what he did. And often we think about the bloodline. You know, you don't want to, it's not a good thing for family to marry. You know, first cousin, second cousin, brothers, sisters. That's not a good thing. For that, some states have laws against it. But all I can do is read on this. But you go to those who know, who studied the purity of blood, and you go back to if Cain did marry a sister or a niece, there's something about the bloodline there. It was so pure that it wouldn't have caused any kind of deformities or anything like that, as it has the possibility of doing today. I mean, you can look that up. Apologetics Press, I think, covers a lot of that on that line. So, but that question was asked, you know, a couple weeks ago. Who was Cain's wife? It had to be a sister or a niece, something like that, family member. Nobody asked the question if Adam and Eve had a navel. Where's y'all's thinking at on that? You should have thought about that one. Did they? No, they didn't have a navel. Because they weren't, God created them in a special way, different way why he creates today. I'm going to give you one. I guess he could have. Don't want you to look different from everybody else. Let's give you a navel. Okay. Now, there's a lot of questions we have that go into the scriptures, and there's logical explanations to them. And it just takes a lot of study and thought on them to try to come up with these answers. I'm not even going to go into the part that many believe that God created two women. And that's really wild. There's studies that thoughts that he created two women. But he didn't. He created only one. I guess that's where some may get the thought it's okay for a man to have multiple wives if they go with God created two women. I guess that's where some could go with that. Anything else tonight? A little bit early getting through. Well, all right. We'll take up next week on another topic. Don't know what it'll be yet.